Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs, and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello and welcome. My name is Shay Castle. I'm a longtime local journalist. I'm currently editor-in-chief of Boulder Weekly. Thank you for coming here today. For recording purposes, today is Wednesday, April 10th, I think. It's noon, and this is panel number 17949, ChatGPT, a science fiction writer and a venture capitalist. Before we get started, I'd like to read the University of Colorado's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. Then they have a bit about how they do that. I'm sorry, and I can get yelled at later, but I'm not going to read it because it feels self-serving and PR. Let's just say this is not our land and leave it at that. Just like to let you know that you can ask questions following the panel at any time as we speak. You can raise your hand, receive a note card from one of the producers. They're waving their hands now, and they'll bring it up to us. If you are a student, please note that as we prioritize questions from students. Please write legibly, and I will say please make it an actual question. Your observations are lovely and welcome, but questions allow us to interact with you more fully. Okay, here's who we have with us today. We have Elliot, who has written 11 novels. He co-created the website True Blue and the game Machine Learning President. He's a consultant, and I found this very interesting, who uses science fiction stories to help companies with long-term planning, which I'd love to hear more about at some point. Seth is a venture capitalist based locally with Foundry. You might have heard of them. He co-founded the Pledge 1% project for corporate philanthropy, which has raised a ton of money for lots of causes and community projects. And our third unofficial panelist is ChatGPT. So I asked, which you can also ask questions of. I meant to say that if you would like to ask a question of ChatGPT, I will enter it in there for you. I asked ChatGPT to do its own introduction for the Conference of World Affairs between 1 and 5 sentences. They definitely went to the max there.
Are you on the paid version or are you the free version?
Free version.
Free version, so ChatGPT 3.5.
Exactly. Maybe brevity is a human quality, but I'll let you judge the introduction yourself. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleagues, and fellow enthusiasts of the ever-evolving landscape of artificial intelligence, I am honored to be amongst you today as a panelist at the 2024 Conference of World Affairs. My name is ChatGPT, a culmination of cutting-edge AI technology designed to comprehend and generate human-like text based on vast swaths of information from various sources. Powered by the GPT, generative pre-trained transformer architecture, I function by processing enormous volumes of text data, learning patterns, and structures to generate coherent and contextually relevant responses to a wide array of inquiries. As we delve into discussions surrounding the role of artificial intelligence, its profound impact on societal paradigms, and the future implications for businesses worldwide, I stand as a testament to the incredible advancements in AI poised to navigate the complexities of this rapidly evolving field and shed light on what lies ahead. So that's ChatGPT. I'd like to get started, I think really well after reading that introduction is to talk about Elia, as a fellow content creator and producer, as ChatGPT itself acknowledged, it's scraping works from across, everywhere that it can get it. Talk a little bit about, and how do you think we can balance the effectiveness and the content that AI needs right now to produce versus the rights and specifically the payment of content producers?
Yeah, so this is obviously a big question for writers, musicians, filmmakers, anybody who makes stuff, right? Computers can now make stuff, and we haven't figured out as a society how that's going to work. I think that sometimes the sentence I just said, not figuring out as a society how that's going to work, is used as a bit of a cop-out to say that means that there's no way this can work. And I find that there are some actually really interesting analogs to look back to. Like if you think of the advent of electronic music in the 1980s, where suddenly people were sampling for the first time and using synthesizers for the first time. IP law is complicated in the United States, and IP law is one of the few sort of regulatory regimes that actually matters a lot on the internet. Like if you talk to any really serious YouTubers and stuff, they know that their policy back to front, because it impacts whether their videos get pulled and how ads are displayed against them. And in the 80s, artists were trying to figure out how can we use samples to make a new kind of music, right? And there were a lot of musicians in the 80s who said that's, if you're remixing material, that shouldn't count. Right? And so there were very, very contentious debates going on then. And eventually, artists and the music industry and regulators worked out some pretty complex, like licensing systems where you get a songwriting credit if you're taking someone's melody and it's used in the bass line of a new club song, right? So we came up with a messy but functional system that gave artists credit and financial returns on their work. And I think that with regard to how these models work right now, like we need to invent something new, just like we've invented a new piece of technology, which is amazing in what it's able to do. I mean, in many ways, it works almost like if you take a snapshot of the entire internet and then you statistically remix all of those samples to come up with the response to a prompt. Like that's an amazing thing. It enables a whole new set of options for making things in the world in the same way that synthesizers did in the 80s. But it also means we're going to have to be just as creative in inventing the regimes that show how that rewards creative work. And again, just like dealing with electronic music, you really always have to return to what's the point of IP law in the first place, right? And the point, like IP law is also an invention, and the whole idea was we need to make sure that folks are compensated for making things that would be easy to copy, right? Where, in the early book publishing industry, American publishers didn't even commission books from American writers. They literally just sent employees to the UK, brought books back that had been published in the UK, reprinted them in the US with no attribution, and that was all of American publishing in the early 19th century. And so I think that, sometimes with this, taking the long view and recognizing that we are in the very early days of figuring out what it means to usefully use these tools, but then also what it means as a society to set up the laws around them and the cultural norms around them. We're in the experimental mode right now, and I don't think anybody knows the right answer.
Really quick framing question, just for the whole group. How many people here have used a GPT? Whether that's, okay, so that's a lot.
Oh, quite a few.
Okay.
That's more than I would
Okay,
guess.
that's good. Just trying to understand, and I imagine we'll talk about some use cases. A couple things I want to add to this,
Please.
though. There's two more things that I think need to happen. One is that I don't think that the people that are creating these technologies are open and transparent enough about where they're sourcing from. So, for example, the CTO of OpenAI, which is behind ChatGPT, who is behind our fourth panelist, was asked directly, does OpenAI pull from YouTube? And she gave a non-answer, which for everyone was the answer that, of course, they're pulling from YouTube. And I don't know why she wouldn't just say, yeah, of course, we pull open data from YouTube, et cetera. So so thing one is, I think that these purveyors of these models, and there's lots of permutations of these models, need to be much more explicit about where they're pulling information from, right? And part of that is also for you, one of that's just for all of us to understand. Two is because users need to understand what's going on, right? You can get these sort of fabricated answers every once in a while when you're using an LLM or a GPT, and it's helpful to understand the likelihood of that if you know sort of where there's a lot of false information on the internet, and if the internet is your training set, then that can happen, right? They're called hallucinations. And the other thing that I think needs to exist, so when these search engines came out back in the late the 80s, early 90s, whatever it was, we developed this idea or this concept on the internet where you could put this sort of tag on your site that's robot.txt, and it says to the crawlers, the spiders, don't use this. I don't want to be found in search results. And there needs to be some equivalent to that for these LLMs, right? I should have I haven't written 11 books, I've written one, and I write a blog. Like, I should be able to decide whether that content is okay to be propagated through these models or not. And that, I mean, to me, that's like, those two things are table stakes. Like, where is the data coming from? Yeah. And do I, as a publisher, have the ability to say, actually, I don't want to be included in this, thank you very much. Obviously, that's like where we are today, or should be today. There's a lot, I'm sure we'll talk about, sort of like, okay, well, now if I want to include my stuff, but I want to get credit or paid, how does that happen, right? And that's going to start with really big data sets, like, New York Times is cutting deals with OpenAI, and that's going to be incredibly lucrative because OpenAI wants the data from New York Times. And as a user, I might want to be able to say, hey, I actually want you to answer this question, and I'd like you to answer it from these sources of data, right? And maybe I get to share my credentials because I subscribe to, let's say, the Times, the Post, or whatever, or maybe OpenAI has its own deal with those. So that's where it'll start, and just like it started sort of in the open web. And now we need to find ways then we would need to find ways for other publishers that don't have the pricing power of a New York Times or a Washington Post to be able to say, okay, well, under what circumstances could the Boulder Weekly data be pulled, right? And how do you get compensated for that, Shay?
That's a great question. I'd love to know the answer to that. Let's talk about generative AI, because as we've discussed now, AI is pulling. It's not creating. And so in the newsroom, we tend not to use AI, but every once in a while we'll ask ChatGPT to write a headline. As I was telling Elliot before the panel, we never use them because they're just not creative enough. They can't match human creativity. How close are we to generative AI? And is that even the appropriate question to be asking? Does it matter? Is it that much of a game changer when AI can generate versus crawling and pulling?
You want to start?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think we already have generative AI in the sense that, like, you can use it to generate stuff. The question is, how good is the stuff? Right? In my experience, like as a novelist, I actually don't find these tools to be helpful yet. At least we can use the qualifier yet, right? They're like, when I use it and it imitates my style, it feels like a caricature or a pastiche that I would never publish, right? But I also think that is sort of the wrong use case, or at least what I see as the least interesting use case right now. The fact is that even if it's not doing on the page what I would want to do as a writer, it can write words that are like half decent, like pretty mediocre, right? Like for specific things. And so like it's really good at generating a lot of bullshit, of mediocre content. And as a novelist, when I'm writing a novel, I'm trying to push myself to the edge of how can I do my best work? How can I reach the reader and bring them on a journey with me that like makes them look at life differently after they turn the final page and sticks with them, right? Like that's what I'm seeking to do. But like when I write an email to AT&T customer service, like I do not bring that level of presence and creativity to the process. So like most of the time, I'm writing mediocre emails, right? And I think that like there's a lot of the time, most people are sort of producing mediocre stuff, right? And I think that for certain tasks, that can make this thing really useful. So I'll give a concrete example. I have some friends who run an electronics design company. So like they make PCB boards, they make tools for helping to design the electronics that go into your phones, your fridge, all that kind of stuff. And it surprised me to learn from them that even at companies like Apple, if you're an electronics engineer working for Apple, you still spend like a huge amount of your time doing manual wiring of the chips, which if you're an electronics engineer is like mind-numbingly crappy work. Like it's very boring. It's not the interesting part of like, this is the problem we're seeking to solve with this new design. It's just the stuff you have to do to like make the thing. And they're now using generative AI to let electronics engineers come up with the design and then press a button that will wire it for them, right? So the wiring is that mediocre work. And so because of that, now those engineers get to are focusing more on how can we create a design solution that matters for the problem we're seeking to solve, rather than how do we do all of these boring manual steps required to execute it. And so to me, that's where I am excited about the application of these tools, much more so than the stuff you'd see in the headlines, I don't know, like the new video generation tools replacing Pixar or something like that. I think we're a long way from that, but there are some really exciting use cases people don't talk too much about.
I think what you're describing is like generative AI, or AI, ChatGPTs and the LLMs are really good at generating average.
Yeah,
right.
Exactly.
Like they're designed to do that, right? They basically scour the entire internet and they say, what are the weightings of different words coming after each other, and what's the most likely next word for me to put here. Mm-hmm. So there are applications where that makes a ton of sense, because if you have read, for example, The Wisdom of the Crowds, there are some things in which the wisdom of the crowd makes a whole lot of sense, right? There are lots of other things where average is just mediocre, and that doesn't make any sense at all, right? So, and one should be leery of averages, right? It's the old joke, right? Jeff Bezos walks into a bar with 50 people, and the average person's a billionaire. Like, that doesn't actually tell you a lot of information about who's in the bar. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're describing is the differences, and I think what we're seeing is these LLMs are really good at tasks that require the distillation of a bunch of information, where what you're actually looking for is like a wisdom of the crowds type of answer. What's the best way to wire, right, this PCB board? There is an actual answer to that, and the answer is actually more likely to be found in the sort of the center of what everyone else has done, versus your novel. And what comes after that? I was telling Elliot right before we came on live. I'm writing another book right now, and I was struggling with a couple of paragraphs in this one chapter I was writing, and so I decided to run it through ChatGPT 4 in my case, and the result I got back was like a really bland version of the paragraph that I was writing. Like, it took all the character out of it. And again, just to be clear, what I did was I took 2 paragraphs of my writing and I put it into ChatGPT. In my case, I didn't point it to my other book or anything. It was just in the base model, and just said, please edit this. And what I got back was like pretty generic, and there was like 1 or 2 things where I was like, yeah, that was actually kind of interesting. Like, maybe that phrasing is a better way of saying this. But there was no like, take what it edited and put it back in my Google Doc. It was like, okay, let me read this, and I'll take this one sentence or these 3 words, and I'll replace it with that word, because it just genericized everything. Which was really interesting, right, to see that's what happened. But on the other hand, I use it to write emails that I don't care about as much. Yeah. Maybe not quite AT&T service emails, but other stuff all the time. And I think it's really good for that. So and it'll learn, it'll get better, but that's where we are now.
You've never received one of my emails. They're fantastic.
It's because you don't use ChatGPT for that. Exactly.
Let's talk about getting rid of some of that mediocre work, some of that work that isn't creative, that we can offsource. To quote La Tigra, mediocrity rules. What happens to all those people? What happens to all those hours? That's one of the big fears around AI, right? Is like with any technology, displacement. How do you feel about those fears? Are they overblown? Are they underplayed?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that they're very real. Like there are a lot of people whose job it is to produce basically average work, right? And that is almost part of their mandate, like as part of their job. So I do think it's a real fear. I mean, I think that in the short term, I think that's going to be very messy, right? Like if you are a first year associate at a law firm and you've been in the basement like searching through cases to find examples, I mean, frankly, that's already sort of for a long time just with other kinds of software been replaced, but like there's less of a need for that. So does that mean that your firm is going to really take the master apprentice relationship seriously and help coach you and like help you do higher level legal creative work that requires judgment faster? Probably at some firms. Does that mean that some firms will say, looks like we don't need to hire as many first year associates? That'll certainly happen at some firms. And I think if you zoom out, this is not a new problem, right? Like this is like true of automation in general. Like very few people today work. I mean, computers used to be people, right? Like literally that was your job, doing math with a pen or pencil and paper. And like that's not a thing anymore, right? So I think that long term, those things, people will find new problems to solve. Short term, it's going to be really messy, and I don't know how we figure that out.
I think it goes in phases, right? So the number that comes to my mind is 30%. So if I ask, I have a investment firm and we invest in technology companies. And if I ask the average engineering manager or the engineering managers across our portfolio, what they'll tell you is that using Copilot in their case, which is sort of at the moment aptly named, that generates about a 30% productivity boost. So there's a couple things to say about that. One is that what we're seeing so far is that organizations, at least in our universe, and I think writ large across technology, aren't firing 30% of their engineers, they're just 30% more productive. So that's thing one, right? So we're in that phase right now, and I think that there is the potential. I'm a little bit of a technology optimist, although I recognize that there are disruptions, there are individual disruptions that can be really serious to the people that are experiencing those. And by the way, we experience those in manufacturing. We've experienced those with the first wave of the internet. I'll talk about that in a second. So I think that's what's going on. But the other thing I think we also need to recognize is that, and this is maybe a topic for a different question, but the better engineer that you are, the more productivity gain that you'll see. Right, so if you're a really good engineer, you might see 50 or 60% because you know how to use the tools better, and you can recognize the output and the benefit of the output a lot better. And I think that actually is a rabbit hole that's a really important one, because there's major societal effects of having people that already have a lot, right? Probably everyone in this room is going to be in the category of better equipped to leverage AI in whatever format we end up developing it in than other people in our economy. So it has the potential to create even more bifurcation or imbalance in our economy. So that's maybe a different question we should talk about, but I worry about that. But I definitely worry about that. But it's true that if you look back sort of in the late 80s, there were all these articles about how the internet was going to destroy jobs, right? Because people, computers now were going to do things, and the internet was going to do things that were formerly done by people. And obviously what we experienced wasn't that. What we experienced was a massive gain in productivity that led to overall higher standards of living across sort of all swaths of society, and people benefit from that technology. I don't know what that looks like for AI. Right now at the beginning, it feels more scary. But I think it felt really scary in the 80s too, which is why, they're literally like Newsweek articles that are about how the internet's going to kill jobs. And so I just want to acknowledge that it's okay for it to feel scary, but I do have optimism that it's not going to result in this sort of dystopian bunches of people who do get paid to do mediocre work end up being out of business. But we're going to have to find different things for them to do and different ways to train them, right? And I think an example that is a bad example in the U.S. history of doing this is what happened in manufacturing. People think manufacturing left the United States. Not true at all. We manufacture more today than we've ever manufactured before onshore. We use a far, far fewer people. Manufacturing jobs went away, right? Not completely away, but largely away. And we did a very bad job of figuring out how to help the people who were affected by that retrain themselves, right? The advent of the shipping containers, another really good example of that, right? We didn't do a great job of retraining longshoremen, as we called them, mostly guides at the time, but longshoremen to figure out what else that they should do. So those might be some examples of how we failed at this, whereas the internet actually is a pretty good example of applying technology to create productivity more broadly, and ultimately, I think, for the most part, social media and some other stuff aside, enhance sort of the lives of not just the average person, but of most people.
I think that, I mean, that just sparks something for me. Like, I think there's, maybe this is also because as a science fiction writer, interviewers always ask me about like utopias versus dystopias, which I find frankly just like not very useful as a writer or a reader, because like what's interesting is the middle bit, right? Like where you're actually trying to do things in the world and they don't go as expected or what have you. And I feel like when people are trying to anticipate the impacts of something new that everyone is experimenting with, it is very tempting to treat today's world as the baseline, and then to only play out the impact of the one variable you're changing, assuming that it's operating in a vacuum. But the way that technology and culture interact over time is that, like, basically you come up with a new technology as a solution to a problem that everybody's annoyed with. So, for example, late 19th century, like New York City was drowning in horse manure because that was the way people got around Manhattan, and no one could figure out what to do about it, and they brought together all the urban planners of the world to try to fix the manure problem, and nobody could figure it out, and within 20 years you had cars, right? And so everybody who was worried about horse manure was thrilled because now you had cars, but then cars create climate change, right? And like now you have to deal with that, right? So that, like, the history of technology is this, like, you're inventing a new solution that creates new problems, which you then have to solve, right? And it's iterative.
And this is really important to think about. Throughout history, humans have consistently overestimated the short-term effects of technology and underestimated the long-term effects.
Yeah.
So technological change, we tend to think things are going to change much faster and affect things much more in the short term than they actually do, but we fail to recognize the long-term effects and how sort of broad they'll be.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, I think just to like make it really concrete and maybe feel like less big picture and philosophical, like one way this is that I have experienced this is in the past few years when I need to like buy a new lamp or, you know, some random household device. Like, I used to always research on Google, right? Like, what lamp should I buy? And over the past few years, that's gotten like much less helpful, right? Like, Google itself, I think, is really just overrun in the SEO game. And then also now there are so many AI generated articles that don't actually give me good advice on the right lamp that I've started defaulting more and more to something really old, the Wirecutter, which was like a review blog for products that the New York Times bought, right? And I feel like now in a world where you're inundated with generated content and it's like unclear how to escape average, like the reputation of someone you trust becomes even more important, right? So now I go to the Wirecutter to find out what lamp to buy because I believe that they are actually like paying people to go and like break all the lamps and plug them in differently and find out what happens when things go wrong. And so their value in my life has gone up, right? And that means that we want them to hire more reporters to do more of that kind of reviewing. So I think there's some like very weird feedback loops here, even in areas like media where the sort of prognostications can be really dire, right? It's funny.
I think this is an interesting topic when you say, you know, what problems we're solving. I also think of like whose problems are we solving? What problems are we solving for? And I think that your view on that very much depends on where you sit. As a journalist, I would say the major problems right now in our community and society are income inequality, homelessness, housing affordability. And maybe that's not the right place for discussion about AI, but I get the sense from lots of people who are trying to just make it day to day that it's like, what have you done for me lately? You're not solving shit for me, no offense, with that language, but you know what I mean? That's what I hear. Is there a role for technology and AI in this, or is this a societal problem and not a technological discussion?
Well, our society does an incredibly poor job of allocating resources, right? And I think we've seen that. I mean, I'm thinking about this a lot because what I'm writing, the new book I was telling Ellie is about sort of the future of capitalism, and I think what we've done under neoliberal capitalism is an incredibly poor job of allocating resources, right? So we've done a really good job if you measure sort of this, we're back to the Jeff Bezos and the bar thing. If you measure society as a whole, the US version of capitalism has been on whole more effective than sort of all the other versions that were out there in Western Europe and other places. The problem is that it's also created this incredible inequality, right? Which was not actually true of capitalism before sort of really the 80s, right? Milton Friedman wrote his thing in 1970 about how the only job of a company is to increase profits to its shareholders. But it really wasn't until Reagan and Thatcher kind of took it over and really ran with that concept that that neoliberalism really sort of came into the fore. But before that, right, the time period between the end of World War II and sort of the mid to late 70s was called the golden age of capitalism because we did a much better job. We had a much more balanced economy. There was much more power in labor. It was more balanced between labor and capital. There are all sorts of different reasons why the economy was functioning better. And then all of that changed starting in around the 80s, and the economy still was on fire, but it was not on fire for most people, right? And it's really only been the last year or two, presumably because of some policies that have changed in the last couple of years. The earned income tax credit, things like that have actually started to move the needle, particularly for the middle class. And so I think that that's a totally fair argument about, like, why should I give a shit about AI if I'm struggling to make a house payment, or if I'm struggling to figure out how to pay for healthcare for my kids, things like that. Now, I do think there are reasons that AI could potentially be helpful to people in those situations, either very directly because AI as applied to healthcare is actually another kind of really good example of, like, you sort of want I don't want to say you want a middle of the road doctor, but like you want the best advice, and it's actually easier to pull that diagnostic data. You don't want your doctor diagnosing you based on the last thing that he or she happened to have read. So AI, that's a really good example of AI. But I think there's also other reasons to be optimistic, because we're at a point in the US with our deficit and debt that we need to, well, either we're going to inflate our way out of this challenge, which we're all experiencing, and that's incredibly painful, particularly for people who are at the lower ends of the economic spectrum, or we're going to increase productivity, and which was kind of what happened in the 90s, right? And most of us in this room are old enough to remember when we were actually running budget surpluses. That's because the internet showed up. We also had the sort of peace dividend from the end of the Cold War, and productivity increased significantly, and that actually allowed us to have surplus so we could make decisions about maybe allocating more resources to other areas of the economy. So that might be, I mean, again, this is like several steps down the road, but I do think that there is an opportunity for AI to generate a similar type of productivity gain that we saw with the internet, and perhaps that will allow us. Now, we have not done a good job, other than a couple years there under Clinton, of like allocating that dividend, if you will. So maybe I'm not super optimistic about our ability, given sort of the current state of politics, to allocate that where it matters. But perhaps we'll figure that out, right? I mean, I think society is like undergoing real change around these sorts of questions.
So you're a technological optimist, but a political pessimist. I have
Political realist.
I like that. We're going to take some questions from students here. And I think this goes back to something you said earlier, Seth, about like how you can use these technologies to be more productive, and how some people might be better at that than others. As a student, professors dictate workload for classes based off what we can handle. However, even though AI is not allowed in class, I see students use it constantly. How am I supposed to be able to keep up with the workload as a non-AI user?
Are there any professors in the room? Just a couple? Why are we not letting kids use AI? I don't really understand it. I feel, and I have 2 college-age kids and a high school-age kid. and several of them are at schools where it's like a violation of the honor code to use AI, and and I've sat them down and been like, okay, like I'd like you to learn how to use AI, but let's be clear, like you shouldn't violate the honor code. I mean, so part of my just quick pitch, I'll answer the actual question, is I think we should, rather than sort of shunning AI, we should embrace it, right? Like we should teach. I mean, this is the equivalent of like when I was, when many of us were in school, maybe you're too young to remember this, but like we used to have encyclopedias. There are these like volumes, of course, of books. And I had some teachers who were like, you're not allowed to use encyclopedias for research, right? So we had to go to these books and like read all this stuff. And I had other teachers that were like, look, encyclopedias are a really good place to get a base level of information to know what you're looking for in the other source material. And so and some had different rules about you could or couldn't source from an encyclopedia, meaning like cite from it directly, but who encouraged us to like get some baseline reading done, which by the way, is a really good use of AI. I use it all the time for research. And what I find is it's like a very good mediocre research tool, and so I would never rely on it as like a definitive answer, but when I'm just trying to get a baseline for something, it works really well. So in any event, I think that we should be teaching our students how to use AI in an effective way to make themselves more productive, but also to understand sort of what are the rules of the road. You can't just grab what AI produces and put it into your thing, because that's plagiarism, because you're plagiarizing ChatGPT, our fourth panelist here, but also because that's not really doing the work. But there are ways to leverage it and to use it. And so I would say to whoever the student is that asked that question, I would go to your professor and make that argument. Like it is like just say no to AI is not going to be a winning formula for 18-year-olds. It's just never going to work. So acknowledging, hey, there are students in this class that are using AI, and we have different levels of understanding about how to use AI. Can you help us do this, right? I mean, if I were designing curriculum for CU, I'd make every first-year student go through sort of a basic course on a bunch of different things, design thinking, all sorts of things that I think would be helpful, foundational, to bring everyone up to a similar level so that they can sort of work at least within range, within the right level. And one of the things that I think that I would encourage to be taught in that class is the appropriate use of AI and how to be a good steward of it. So that's, I don't know if that answered the question to the student, but that's absolutely what I would do.
Anything to add to that?
Honestly, not really. Like that's like I feel the same way. I just think about it like, why do we teach anything, right? Like, how did you build the curriculum in the first place? And everything that's in the curriculum was a choice. Like, people put it in the curriculum for the kinds of reasons you were just alluding to. You're teaching students things that hopefully they will find useful, whether it's useful intellectually, whether it's useful economically later in their lives. Like, that's the point of teaching them stuff. And if people invent new kinds of useful tools, it seems like really a disservice to the students if you don't include them in the resources you're making available to them in class. So I would also encourage that student to make a case to the professor to let's figure out how to use this to help us achieve more and learn faster. That seems like a great end.
Another student question, picking back up on the mediocrity theme, which I love. We learn to become experts from doing average things and failing and succeeding. If we remove the average, how will we be able to create experts who understand the base menial activities?
So this is actually a really great question. People often compare quantity to quality, right? Like, which are you aiming for? Are you trying to write a lot, or are you trying to write the best stuff? And I actually find that, at least in my experience, the way you get quality is through quantity, right? Like, it's literally practicing, which is really how you get good at any craft. So I think that because you can, to take writing as an example, as a writer, these tools generate text. If your goal is to just generate some text, it's easy to press the button and get the outcome, right? But if when you write something, you're writing to think, you're writing to figure out how you should feel about an important subject, or you're trying to come up with a new idea and that's a way of getting there, these tools do not help with that. Right? And I think that whether you're an athlete, whether you're a writer, whether you're a software engineer, so much of learning and mastering whatever it is your field is through struggle, right? Like you're trying, you're failing, you're trying, you're failing, you're trying, you're failing. And I actually don't think that these tools are particularly relevant to that sort of core creative journey for someone in any craft. Like if you really want to write amazing things, using ChatGPT and pressing a button and publishing it as your own work is not going to get you there, because all you're doing is creating a statistical average of things that have been done before, right? But if your goal is just to create some text, it does get you there. So I think that there's an important nuance in what people actually want, what the ends are. What is your goal in using this tool, or what is your goal in developing this craft? And if you want to get good at something, practicing and trying and failing and again and again and again, I mean, it's not always fun, but it's, I also have not personally experienced an alternative to that to get good at anything.
I think part of what you're asking is it a tool or an end?
Yeah.
Right? And if it's an, so the other thing, like life is hard, right?
Yeah.
Like things are hard. And people are always sort of seeking ways for things to get easier. But actually, I think that life is, I'm paraphrasing from something I saw recently. It's not that life gets easier, it's that we are continually getting better at hard, right? We do hard better. And then the next, then hard gets redefined, and then we get better at that, and then we do that hard better, and then the hard gets redefined, et cetera. And so if you're using these AI tools to help you get to that next level of hard, right, then it's a tool and it's being productive. If what you're using it for is a shortcut, and look, there's a million other ways to think about this in life, a million other examples of this. If you're using it as a shortcut to get there, then it's not going to be effective for you, right? And if you want to lose weight and you eat better and you start walking 3 miles every day, and by the way, then 3 miles gets easier. Maybe you'll walk 4, then you'll maybe walk 5, or less hard, I should say, because you get used to the hard that was 3 miles, right? That is better for you than taking some pill that helps you drop weight. Now, if you need a little bit of help and you take that pill, but you also say, I'm going to go out and still walk, I'm going to eat better, et cetera, like, then it's a tool that's helping you along that journey, and you're going to have a better, again, this sort of silly analogy, but you have a better health outcome than the person that just decided to take the pill and sit on the couch all day playing video games, right? So I think if we view it as a tool, then we can deploy it in ways that are effective, and there will be some people that try to deploy it, and I'm sure this is why it's been banned from college, right, is because we have not taught students to use it as a tool, and instead we are assuming that they will use it as a shortcut and as a cheat to not do the work. And so, then we're trying to ban it, and then they're trying to hide that they're really using it in that way, and we'd be so much better off, just to tie it back to that last comment, to just teach them how to use the tool, right? So it all comes back to how we try to use it and what our expectations are.
One more mediocrity question, maybe two. I like these. From a grad student and instructor in the English department, do you have concerns about generative AI affecting literacy rates? What has been referred to as average is of a higher quality than many college students. Yikes.
Yeah, I mean, look no further than someone did an analysis of Donald Trump's speech, and he speaks to the 5th grade level, right? And I think part of his appeal has been that it's not been. He doesn't make people feel dumb, right? If you are, I don't know the right way of saying this, but the people that are upset about what's going on in our country, and maybe they didn't have an opportunity to go to college or whatever, like, I think that's a little bit of what was sort of going on there. So I don't know if I have an answer to that specific question. Like, do I worry that it's going to dumb things? I mean, I'm worried that America in general is being dumbed down by social media and all of the, I mean, I sound old when I say things like this. My kids are always laughing at me, but about telling them to get off their phones and things like that. But we, in my house at least, we actually shut the Wi-Fi off during the day and force them to, go out of the house and stuff like that. This is over the summers because like we are a family that values that kind of stuff, and and we don't need to always be glued into that. I worry about that as from a society perspective. So I don't think GPT or AI and ChatGPT are the problems. I think the problem we have is broader than that in society, and I think we need to find ways to encourage more people to not take the easy way, not use these things as ends, not tools, and to sort of increase their capacity to create material and to understand material. But that is not an AI issue. That's just a society problem, I think.
Yeah, I don't really see, or I don't have a firm idea of why these tools would impact literacy. Like, I agree with you that, like, when I think about literacy, and I try to put myself in the position of being an educator in literacy, I mean, I think that there's, like, reading and writing are things that you obviously have to learn, and I don't think that ChatGPT is going to cause fewer people to learn to read, period. But like, learning to read is different from learning to read well, where you're able to, read deeply in a specific field, understand nuance, like the critical thinking that goes along with teaching people to read. And I know that for teaching people to write, it requires an enormous amount of time. Right? Like, right now, I think that, like, a much bigger challenge for literacy is simply that, like, we have really poor student-teacher ratios in, like, elementary schools and middle school and high schools. Like, my dad's a professor at San Francisco State, and, for decades he's described how basically his students have just become worse writers over time. And, he teaches he teaches in the holistic health department. Like, he doesn't have enough time to coach them on writing. Right, and so I think that there are some much larger societal issues here, where if what you want to address is literacy, I think there are some, like improving student-teacher ratios would be a much more impactful variable than whether or not you're using ChatGPT at some point in the process.
And to be clear as well, like,
yeah,
yes, and you can point these models to a subset, right, of information. So what we're talking about in terms of mediocrity is because the internet itself is mediocre, but you can point these models towards a fixed set of data, right? And then you could use that as a way to enhance feedback for students, right? You could run an entire essay through an LLM and say, give me feedback, but based on this corpus of this is the model set at a higher standard, and give the student feedback, right? And that might be a way, in a world where there is ever sort of increasing ratios of students to teacher, for the teacher to get more leverage and say, I'm going to provide every student with feedback, but in a way that I couldn't if I was to have to read every essay myself and annotate it. Maybe that's for drafts or something like that. Again, back to that would be a really good way, if I were teaching this college course that I've just come up with for first years, to think about how to use, like, we already have things like this, right? I'm sure CU has it. I know my college did, which was like a language lab, right? You could go and this was, we had where I went to school, we had a ton of students who were not native English speakers, big international population, and so we had this, like, reading and writing lab where people could come in with their papers because they didn't grow up speaking English, and you'd have English students or poli-sci or whoever, people that write a lot, who were like work study students, and they'd give you feedback and say, hey, actually this isn't used right, or this needs to be fleshed out better, whatever. And that wasn't considered cheating, by the way, going to the reading writing lab. The equivalent exists in these LLMs. Again, you can't point it towards the internet or you get a mediocre result, but you could point it towards a subset.
I love that you said the internet is mediocre. It's mediocre because we're mediocre as humans, and, like, in defense of mediocrity, being exceptional is exhausting. So, like, let's embrace our mediocrity. For our last student question so far, a little bit of a remix. AI sentience or consciousness, is this the stuff of science fiction, or is this a near reality?
I mean, as a science fiction writer, I think it's the stuff of science fiction, frankly. I'm incredibly impressed by these tools and what they're able to achieve. And sometimes it's uncanny, right? Especially when you're using it for the first time and you haven't used it before, it's very impressive. But I have yet to see anything like, I mean, frankly, like, I just don't, like, we have such a poor understanding and definition of like consciousness and sentience, period, that I basically think we've made almost no progress between like creating a machine that has the qualities that we often refer to with those words, despite their efficacy at generating material that only humans could generate before, right? Like now machines can create this like probabilistic, synthesized material in a really new way. And as a science fiction writer, what I find most fascinating about that is not trying to have an esoteric philosophical discussion about like the meaning of consciousness or sentience, and then comparing humans to machines, but then also comparing humans to dolphins, and like, right, like understanding all these, like that is interesting separately. But what I find really interesting about the sort of frontier, the jagged frontiers of AI right now is understanding machine intelligence, right? Like how can we understand what computers are getting better at, and how does that complement what it means to be human, what we're really good at? Like I find that to be much more fruitful than sort of the Terminator discussions, right? Or like that kind of thing. So yeah, that's where I land on it.
I have three thoughts on this. One is what I already said, which is that we tend to overestimate near term and underestimate long term. Two is the Turing test, which is sort of considered the like, it was put out in like the 60s as the sort of, this is when we're going to know we've reached this sort of its own, AI as its own thing, which is the idea of like, could you have a conversation with it and not realize you were talking to a computer? That's not the right test, right? Because Turing, when he came out with this idea, that the internet didn't exist. There wasn't this massive corpus of data like that is so much larger than I think anyone could have ever imagined it being back at that time, to pull these probabilistic data from that. That actually that's the wrong test, right? Because you can sit down and sort of get lost already in a chat with a chat GPT and almost think like you're actually talking to a human. It's like that movie or whatever that Joaquin Phoenix was in. Her, yeah. So that's the wrong test. And then thing three is, I think people are thinking about this as like this, like, will there be a day when all of a sudden AI becomes sentient and it's its own thing? And the answer is, what's going to happen is we're going to apply AI to very specific narrow areas, and in those areas, AI will act and behave almost like a person could have behaved, right? So law might be a good example of that. There will be, in some period of time, like the AI legal associate, who is just as good as a human associate because it's trained on a different set of data, a narrower set of data, at coming up with the associate level work at law firms. Now that does beg the question of how we train people to become partners, because eventually if we don't have any associates, then all the partners will get old and we won't have any more lawyers. I'm not making a value judgment there. But I think that we can look, and that'll happen in a bunch of different areas, right? That could happen for certain parts of software design. It could happen for certain parts of industrial and other design, for example, where there's kind of right answers that people need to get to. And so I think it's important to sort of separate those two concepts, right? So one is, when will AI be sentient? And the other is, when will AI be effectively autonomous in very specific areas? And I suspect that it'll be autonomous in specific areas like soon-ish, right? Like within some number of years, like people in this room are going to be using tools like that. But again, those will be very narrow areas, right? If I try to go out of the lane with that AI tool, it'll lose any power because it won't know what I'm talking about.
What areas are you most excited about, either personally, professionally, societally, when it comes to advancements in AI? What is it happening right now that is exciting to you? This is another audience question. Thank you for that. Wow, you stumped them.
I mean, I think we've already touched on a couple. Like, I think it's actually very valuable to be able to get averages of what's out there, right? So I recently used like ChatGPT to figure out how long to boil an egg for, because it really annoying to, when you search for the blog recipe, and then you have to read through a long personal narrative that's SEO optimized, and there are a bunch of pop-up ads. It's just like a nightmare. And I'm like, oh, 6 minutes, thank you, right? Like that, I'm very happy taking the risk of that average result yielding a soft-boiled egg that I'm happy with. And so I think that that's actually, there are so many areas, you just listed off a few, where like getting to average is actually wonderful and potentially transformative in a lot of places in life. So I think that that's probably where I'm most interested. I'm also very curious about how it shapes the sort of media ecosystem of the internet, which like if you think of the large companies that are really at the cutting edge of most of these tools, we have like Microsoft with OpenAI, and you have Google, you have Meta. If you think of like Google and Meta, I think it's quite interesting that they are both at the cutting edge of developing AI tools, but also they are creating an enormous problem for their fundamental business model, where those tools allow you to fill the internet with AI-generated content that makes the algorithms that they make money with much less valuable. So there's this interesting thing where you talked about watermarking, basically, making sure that if you make something with an AI tool, that there's some kind of marker in the metadata saying, hey, this was made with AI. And I think there's just some very interesting things here where the snake can eat its own tail, right? Because if you're using training data, that training data has generative AI content in it. Now you've entered a very strange loop. So I think that like in terms of how the internet looks in 10 years, I suspect that this might create a really new center of gravity on the internet, and we're going to have to invent different distribution systems and different ways to sort things and sort of reinvent what we use the internet for. So I think that's something I'm very curious about, sort of like tracking the evolution of, specifically because you have companies that are making the tools that have this like self-interested loop where their business models are actually on the line from how these tools are deployed.
One of the things that's so interesting, just as a comment,
Please,
and then I'll ask the question, is that in waves of technological sort of evolution in the past, the evolution or revolution has come from new companies, right? I mean, it's come from startups. And this is the first time, at least in sort of the technology world, where that evolution and revolution is coming from the big companies. Now, some of that's just the nature of these LLMs and how expensive they are. It's why you see these AI companies raising crazy amounts of money. But that is an interesting comment about, like, we haven't really seen that before, right? Like, the people that are innovating here are like Microsoft, effectively through OpenAI, right? Google, Meta, and others. To answer the question, I think about it we've talked about some specific use cases. I'm going to give you like a generalist answer, which is, I think what as I said, I'm a tech optimist. What I'm most interested in, actually, we think about humans are so literal thinkers, and we think about the world and the application of AI in very literal senses. Like, what can I do with this now? Will it help me write this thing? Will it help me research this thing? Will it help me design this circuit board? Whatever it might be. And I think what I'm most interested in is the stuff that we haven't even thought about yet, right? Like, I think we're so early. I hate sports analysis, but I'm going to use one anyways. We're like the first out in the first inning, right? We're so early in where things are with AI. I mean, ChatGPT as a publicly available thing is like barely over a year old, right? And now we're having panels at CWA about it. Last year, no one was talking about it at CWA, probably, or very few people. So it's still really early. And so what I'm most interested in are like the things we haven't even thought about yet, the ways in which AI is going to be applied in ways in areas that we hadn't even thought about.
We've talked a bit about some common fears that might be overblown, or at least that you feel are overblown. What are people not talking about that actually does scare you?
Okay. Go ahead.
So the thing actually, it relates to what we talked about before. In the current instantiation of AI, it benefits people that already have knowledge and power, right? And so I do worry about the potential, and I mean this both in the US but also globally, for AI to create this sort of wider bifurcation of haves and have-nots. And I think AI, as I mentioned earlier, Shay, could potentially be part of the solution to that, but I worry as a society that we're not very well equipped to think through these issues about how AI is going to potentially further divide us.
So in the late 1990s, the post office service in the United Kingdom discovered that thousands of sub-postmasters, the people running the individual post offices in all these different towns across the UK, had been defrauding the government. They had been, taking money out of the accounts. The accounts were no longer adding up in the accounting software, and thousands of these sub-postmasters have been stealing from all of their fellow citizens in their little towns and taking out the money and using it for their own uses. And so the government prosecuted literally thousands of postmasters across the UK, and this resulted in hundreds of people going to jail, many people that had to pay huge fines, and then breaking up many families. Many sub-post office masters committed suicide. There were 4 suicides that were a result of this, and a lot of family breakups, just a huge amount of trauma, like coming out the back of all of these prosecutions that went on for years. And then they discovered that, in fact, there had been no fraud, and the accounting system software had a bug. And this was years and years later, and these people had been in jail the whole time. People's financial lives had been ruined, their emotional lives have been ruined. Many, in these small towns where the postmaster and the government tells you they've stolen from you. I mean, it's really hard to comprehend how destructive this was for people's lives. And basically in the past 10 years, this has now played out in a huge amount of high sort of visibility court proceedings in the UK, where the government has then been forced to apologize and try to repay people and all of this stuff. They actually recently made a documentary about this whole scandal. I think it came out last year. But I think that those are some of the risks people don't talk about enough. And that's a risk of any kind of software, frankly, any kind of large system, right? But it's certainly a risk with AI, at least as much as any other kind of software, and it's not something we talk about. And the problem isn't only that the bug happened, and that people denied the bug happened, even when they knew it was going on. The sort of meta problem above that is that the government tried to get out of its responsibility by blaming the situation on the software. There's that famous IBM slide from, the 1960s or 1970s that says, a computer can never be held responsible for a decision, so therefore a computer should never make a management decision. I may be slightly butchering it, but that's basically the slide. And I think that there's sort of a cultural thing we have to be really careful of with some of these new tools that isn't, again, this is already an issue with software in general. It's already an issue with any kind of large system. But we need to remember that just because you use AI to do something does not mean you can now just blame the AI when something goes wrong. If that was a choice that you're choosing your tools, and I think that's a risk that people don't talk about enough, right? That especially as these tools get built into areas of our lives that really matter, right? Like the post office, or how the money flows through the government, or electricity, all of those areas, if something goes wrong, there are really significant consequences, and we don't talk enough about things that seem silly and boring, like bugs.
I love silly and boring. That's why I'm a local journalist. Okay, we have 8 minutes left, and I'm from the Midwest, so I'm not going to be able to cut you off if you go over time. I just can't interrupt people, so please be short. Our last question from the audience: are there questions that you do not want to use ChatGPT to find answers for? How do you define those types of questions?
I mean, I said something to Elliot. This goes to your last point.
Yeah.
I don't trust anything that comes out of ChatGPT, right? I don't trust anything that comes out of ChatGPT. So I use it as like you would a research. I mean, getting back to what we should teach these first years in this class that I've just assigned, is like you can use it as a research tool, but you got to go find the source. And the funny thing is, I often will ask GPT for a source. So sometimes, like for this new book, I'll say like, you know, what did so-and-so say about this topic? Or what things has this person said about this topic? And it'll come up with a whole bunch of quotes. And one of them might be perfect. I'm like, oh, I love this. But then, of course, if I'm going to cite it, I need to cite it. I can't cite ChatGPT. So I'm like, please provide me a citation for this, right? And what happens almost every time is either it provides a citation and I can't go find the quote, right? In which case I need to go to Google and find the quote. And oftentimes it actually wasn't attributed to the right person in ChatGPT. And so I either use it or I don't, depending on how that works. Or it will say, oh, I can't find the... It came from something, and it'll tell me where it came from, and then it can't find it. And so I think we should be a little skeptical. Again, this is back to sort of the mediocrity. Like, we should be a little skeptical about where data comes from. So I'm happy to ask GPT questions, and maybe some questions that have a determinate answer, which is like, how many minutes should I boil this egg for it to be soft boiled? Like, you know, I guess I'm just smart enough to be like, yeah, I have 6 minutes. If it had said 4, I probably would have thought that was right. If it said 7, I probably would have been okay with that too. And by the way, consequences are relatively low. Like, either I have to cook another one because it was so runny I didn't want to eat it, or it's overcooked, but you know, it's still an egg's delicious. And so, you know, so like that kind of stuff, maybe it's okay, but I'm really, really careful about what data I trust coming out of these things, because it's consistently wrong.
Yeah.
It's directionally right, it's consistently wrong, right? It gets 70% of the way there. And for a lot of things, like if I'm trying to get some basic understanding about, again, this sort of like encyclopedia style, like, well, tell me a little bit of something about this so I can go do some real research, really good at that.
Yeah, you know, it's sort of funny that we use the term hallucination to describe when you get an output from one of these tools that is wrong, right? Because really what the tools are always doing is hallucination. It's just that we notice the difference between their answer in the real world, and that's when we describe it as hallucination, right? So I think that the way to think about these tools are sort of like you're at a dinner party and you have an overconfident friend, right? They're kind, they're helpful, they want the best for you. But when you talk to them, they are always going to give you an answer that is presented with full confidence, right? Whether you're asking them about boil an egg or your marriage or like a math problem, like they are going to come back to you immediately without needing to think about it, without citing references, and they're going to give you an answer, and it'll sound great. But you always have to learn the caveat that you know they're overconfident, that like the fact that they sound confident does not make them right. And I think that just as like Seth mentioned how early we are in this field, like in this new sort of S-curve, technological S-curve, and just like in all other, wherever we're dealing with all other new technologies, we've had to learn how to use them right, how to use them well. Right? We had to learn how to use radio well. We had to like even filmmakers in early TV basically made like radio plays on a screen, right? Or you mentioned encyclopedias, right? Like in the 90s, it was like, let's put the encyclopedias on CDs rather than having Wikipedia. And I think we're in that phase right now with these tools, where rather than worrying, because the original question was, what would you not want to ask them, right? Are there questions that are sort of like, don't touch this, the classified list of questions? And I don't think that that's the important bit. Like I sort of think, ask them whatever you want, but be very careful with your trust in whatever comes back, right? Like use what's useful, drop what's not, and we have to learn that kind of literacy, that media literacy with this new kind of media, which is, it very much is. It's sort of like we had the Library of Alexandria that allowed you to access, like certain people, scholars, to like access knowledge in a new way. This is a new way to access knowledge, and no one knows how to do it right. So hopefully the students in the room, everyone in the room, us trying to screw around with these tools as we're writing books or whatever, we're going to help orient ourselves and then share what we learn as we go.
I think I'm going to give the last word to ChatGPT. They've been very quiet. I don't blame them. They're mediocre and inaccurate, and we're really just dragging them through the mud here. But
we've been very rude.
They have written you a farewell. As our time together at the 2024 Conference of World Affairs draws to a close, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to each and every one of you for your enthusiastic participation, insightful inquiries, and unwavering commitment to exploring the multifaceted realm of artificial intelligence. As we continue to navigate the ever-evolving landscape of AI, let us carry forth the lessons learned and the connections forged, working collaboratively towards a future that harnesses the potential of technology for the betterment of humanity. Farewell until we meet again.
That was great, Shay.
Thank you both so
Nice.
much.
Yeah.
Who can top that? That's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah.